Hello everyone, welcome back to the workshop. Today is going to be another knife video. This time, rather than making a knife for anybody else, I finally decided to make something for myself. I have been wanting a decent set of kitchen knives for quite a while now and figured I might as well just go ahead and make them for myself rather than buying them from anyone else. So this particular knife will not be for sale since it is for myself, but if you are interested in ordering something similar, I encourage you to contact me at any of these social media links that you can find in the description of this video. So of course, after laying the knife out with layout fluid and sort of sketching it up and finding out exactly what I wanted the design to be like, the first step was to cut out the blank from the steel. This is 01 tool steel I am using for this knife. And I am making a Japanese style kitchen knife called a Nakiri, which is mainly for chopping vegetables and works fine for boneless meats as well. After roughly cutting out the profile on the bandsaw, I brought it over to the milling machine and got it set up with the measurements I had designed. For this knife, I am trying a new handle construction. It's a wall handle, but with sort of a little interesting connection point to the handle. So I needed things to be really exact because I hadn't done this before and I wanted to make sure it was all going to fit together perfectly at the end. So that's why I did so much of this profiling on the milling machine rather than simply bashing it out on the belt sander real quick. Once the profile was completely finalized on the milling machine, I brought it over to the belt grinder to start working on the bevels. Since the Nakiri is a completely straight edge design, it is a perfect time to use a grinding jig, so I clamped it up to my jig. On this side, it is a 70-30 grind, so it is an asymmetric double bevel. I did the angle such that the grinds would reach the same height, but the point would be off-centered because I wanted it to act as a bit of a wedge to shove vegetables away from the cutting edge. Obviously, I am right-handed, so the bevels were configured for a right-handed knife setup. Once I had the main bevels ground in, I decided to do an S grind on this knife, which basically means sticking in a hollow halfway up one of the bevels. Basically, this is done to make it so vegetables, especially things like potatoes that are sort of sticky and starchy, will not suction onto the side of the knife and they'll fall away a lot easier. This grind just makes it so air can get underneath them as you are chopping them, which does not happen if you simply leave it as a full flat grind. Vegetables stick to that really badly. And this was my first experience doing this type of grind, but it actually turned out really well, so I am very happy with it. Once I had the bevels roughed in and that S-grind hollow roughed in, it was time for some hand sanding prior to heat treat. Normally I do very little, if any, hand sanding prior to heat treat, but I accidentally went a little too far with my roughing belts here, and I didn't want to risk getting it too thin before heat treat because that would increase the chance of warping or even cracking if I got the edge really thin. So it cost some extra time, but I was happy I did it. Just went in here and cleaned everything up with hand sanding to get it nice and smooth for the heat treat to avoid any major stress risers. Next up, it was time for the heat treat, so here I am doing the heat treat in my homemade heat treating oven. It works okay, but it's not really that accurate, so this year for Christmas I decided to take advantage of some Black Friday deals and order myself a more legitimate even heat kiln for heat treating knives in the future. However, this has served me well and I've done several knives in it and it was really cheap to put together, so I'm planning to fiddle with it a little more, see if I can get the accuracy up and use it as a tempering oven in the future, because that should be a little more accurate than the toaster oven that I am currently using for tempering. Nothing too special here. After heat treating, I simply took it to the sandblaster to blast off all of the scale left from the heat treating, and then went right back to hand sanding. Whole lot of hand sanding here because, again, I had taken it too far on the machine initially, so I didn't want to risk bringing it in too thin on the edge. So it was a lot of hand sanding, brought it all the way up to a nice 400 grit in preparation for the atchit-essing process that I was planning. Now that the blade was pretty much completed, everything done except for that acid etching, it was time to start working on the handle, so it was back down to the milling machine. I used aluminum spacers here in a two-tone wood handle made of ebony and cocobolo. This is the front aluminum spacer, the one that'll be right on the front. I guess you could call it a bolster in a traditional knife construction. Again, I was trying sort of a new design here, so I milled a slot all the way across in one side, and then a hole through the other side for the tang to actually go through, and you'll see how it all fits together at the end. And then it was just a whole lot of work with a little carbide end mill going back and forth and slotting out the different pieces that would fit into the into the handle construction. I'm not going to show all the pieces here, it's basically just the same thing over and over, pecking away a little bit at a time with this carbide end mill. Here I am gluing all the handle pieces together once they were completed. I apologize for the rather crappy camera angles at some point. Still getting the hang of this recording thing while I'm making stuff. But you can see the way it all fit together. I drilled little holes alongside the slots for pins to go in just to make sure that everything would be aligned properly. Glued it all up in order, and then several times over about the next 20 minutes while it was drying, I just made sure to slide the tang of the knife in and out to get any squeeze out on the inside to make sure it wasn't going to clog up the hole and make it impossible for me to get the knife in when it dried. Once the handle was all glued together, I took it to the bandsaw and sliced off the bulk of the extra wood that was sticking out, and then over to the belt sander to bring it down to a perfect square, a 1-inch square in this case, based on the final intended size of the handle. A couple times I accidentally got it a little too hot while I was belt sanding the pieces of aluminum, and the glue joints actually came apart, so I had to do a couple of re-glues actually, which was a pain in the butt. But at the end I got it all down to where it needed to be and drilled the hole for the handle pin. Again, I had laid this out all nicely beforehand and carefully used the milling machine to position my hole in the tang, so I was able to put the hole exactly where it needed to be here, and I intentionally biased it 1/1000th further forward than it needed to be. That way when I hammered the pin through, it shoved the handle really snugly up against the back of the shelf on the tang. That made the whole thing really solid, and even before I glued it together, when I test fitted it, just shoving the pin through, there was no wobble in the handle, so I was really happy with the way that turned out. After a final little bit of hand sanding on the top and bottom of the handle, just to make sure that it would perfectly match the knife, again I test fitted up with the pin through to line it up perfectly and sanded to make sure that the knife and handle were completely flush in the little areas where I had the tang shelf overlap the front of the bolster piece. I brought it down to the milling machine again and clamped it in some V blocks here to work on turning it into the sort of traditional octagonal wash shape. I decided I wanted a little more interesting of a shape rather than just a plain octagon, so I actually used a little spacer under the front of the V blocks to angle the whole thing. And at the end of the day I made it so that it is a perfect octagon on the front of the handle, and then it tapers outwards as it moves back, so the back is closer to a square rather than an octagon. It made it a really visually interesting handle, and I still like the way it felt in my hand a lot. I was a little worried it might be uncomfortable as it got squarish toward the back, but usually you're holding knives like this up in a pinch grip around the front of the handle anyways, and it's really comfortable, so I was really pleased with the way it turned out and the way it looked. After I got the final shape I wanted done on the milling machine, it was back to a bit of hand sanding, brought the handle all the way up to 2000 grip, and then brought it here to the buffing wheel, where I went through mostly just brown buffing compound and then a little hit on the white as well, just to bring the whole thing up real nice and shiny. I'm really pleased with the way it turned out overall. Not totally happy with the way the aluminum came out. I've never actually buffed aluminum before, and after reading some once I was struggling, it turns out it's actually pretty difficult and involved to get aluminum to a real perfect mirror finish. But still, I was happy with the way it turned out, and now it was time to finalize the blade. I really like the look of Hamones on knives, particularly Japanese style blades like this one, but since I was using 01 steel, since that's what I've got, 01 steel is a through hardening steel, meaning you can't really produce a real Hamone on 01, not a very noticeable one anyways, so I decided to fake a Hamone through acid etching. And I figured why not go ahead and fake a double Hamone. I don't know if that's even a real thing anyone does on real Hamone steels, but why not? I thought it would look cool, and I am pleased with the way it turned out. So as you can see here, I just used some nail polish to mask off a wavy line, and through several different stages of acid etching, I made a couple different wavy lines, and you'll see what the final result looks like in the pictures at the end. Once the acid etching was done, I decided that I wanted to rough the whole thing up, give it a little more rugged, sort of forged look, and it would also make it so scratches through use would be less noticeable, so I stuck the thing in a tube full of soapy water and ceramic tumbling media, and just shook it around and kicked it around on the ground for 5 minutes. With the handle and the blade both now completed, it was time for the glue up. So as you can see here, I just poured a bunch of epoxy down the tang hole, to make sure it would coat the whole inside there and I'd get a nice solid fit up. Pounded the little pin through the handle, again, gave that nice pressure fit that made the whole thing really nice and tight and snug, so I don't think it should ever have any risk of coming apart. And after this was done, of course, I had to go down, saw off the little bits of extra pin that were sticking off the sides of the handle and sand that down flush, and then rebuff those sides back up to the nice finish. After that, I followed the whole thing up with a coat of Minwax finishing paste wax, just to protect the wood handle a little bit, seal it, and prevent any cracking or bacteria growth. At this point, all there really was left to do was put an edge on the knife. I was experimenting with a new process this time, using some different belts to do the sharpening right on the grinder, and I am very pleased with the way it turned out. I will probably be sticking to this process from now on. Put a really wicked edge on it, and it took basically no effort. So what I did here for this process is started out with a 400 grit Trizact belt. You could start 220 if you had like a really thick edge left there, but I brought this one pretty thin before sharpening, so I started right at the 400 to put on an initial edge, then went up to a 1200 grit Trizact, and then a 2500 grit Trizact. The reason I use the Trizacts is because they don't heat up the steel like at all, just because of the way they're put together. There's little air gaps between all of the little grit chunks. So it made it so I could just sharpen it right up without having to dunk or anything. Of course, I carefully monitored it because I wasn't sure how cool it was going to be, but I could keep my finger right on it and couldn't even feel any heat buildup whatsoever with the Trizact belts. And then after the Trizacts, to get the little tiny burr off from that 2500 grit, I finished up on a plain cork belt loaded with green buffing compound. And again, it just put a really wicked sharp edge on it. No time at all, so I'll definitely be using this in the future. Thank you so much for watching this video. Here are some photos rolling in the background of the final knife. Really pleased with the way this one turned out, and I can't wait to start working on the rest of the little kitchen set I'm planning. Again, this one is not for sale because I made it for myself, but if you are interested in ordering a custom knife, please feel free to contact me at any of these social media links that you can find below this video. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you want to see more like it or content on really a wide range of things, I do all sorts of stuff on my channel. Feel free to subscribe and turn on that little notification bell so that you can see when new videos go live, and I will see you all next time.